June 1944. The Normandy coast rests under a low, gray sky. Concrete bunkers sit half buried in sand, their edges softened by wind and salt. Steel hedgehogs rust quietly at the waterline. Barbed wire hums faintly as the tide pulls back. For years, these structures have been part of the landscape, unmoving, unquestioned. To the civilians in nearby villages, they are not symbols of war anymore. They are symbols of certainty. German families wake to the sound of waves and distant engines. Not alarms, not panic, just the steady noise of the Atlantic. Children pass reinforced gun positions on their way to fetch water. Farmers work fields that lie within sight of artillery casements. The Atlantic Wall is there. It has always been there. Thick concrete, deep guns, endless obstacles. The belief is simple and widespread. Nothing can cross this shoreline and survive. But on this morning, the sea looks different. Far out on the horizon, dark shapes interrupt the line where water meets sky. Not warships alone, but structures that do not belong to any navy. Floating forms that seem to assemble themselves where open water once ruled. By nightfall, the coast will no longer feel permanent, and certainty will begin to erode under the weight of something far more powerful than guns. That quiet confidence was built long before this day, shaped by years of promises, doctrine, and belief. The concept of Fortress Europe was not born on the beaches of Normandy. It was forged in the aftermath of rapid victory. By the summer of 1940, Germany controlled a coastline that stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish frontier. France had fallen. The Low Countries were occupied. Norway's ports and airfields were in German hands. To many within the Reich, the war in the West appeared settled. The enemy had been pushed across the Channel. The land war, it seemed, was over. What remained was defense. From Berlin, planners envisioned a wall, not a single structure, but a continuous system of fire, obstacles, and denial. Concrete bunkers housed heavy artillery. Machine gun nests were positioned to overlap fields of fire. Beaches were seeded with mines and wooden stakes tipped with explosives. Inland, anti-tank ditches cut through farmland. Roads were measured, marked, and mapped for demolition. The Atlantic Wall, as it came to be called, was both physical and psychological. German newsreels showed smiling workers pouring concrete into massive forms. Maps displayed thick black lines hugging the European coast. Speeches described an impenetrable barrier, a defense so formidable that invasion itself would become unthinkable. For civilians living along the coast, these messages were reinforced by daily experience. They saw construction crews year after year. They watched weapons arrive by rail and truck. They heard artillery practice echo across the water. Each new bunker made the shoreline feel heavier, more rooted. War to them felt distant, something happening elsewhere. The belief spread quietly. Even if the Allies tried, they could not stay. German military doctrine supported this confidence. Defensive theory emphasized attrition at the waterline. Invaders would be forced to land under fire, pinned between sea and shore. Supplies would be destroyed before they could be organized. Without ports, without railheads, without secure depots, any landing force would collapse under its own weight. This assumption was not irrational. History seemed to support it. Large-scale amphibious operations were rare and notoriously fragile. Even successful landings required functional ports, deep water access, and uninterrupted supply lines. Germany believed it held the key advantage. Europe's major ports were fortified, mined, and prepared for demolition. German commanders debated where the invasion would come. Calais, with its short channel crossing, seemed logical. Normandy, with its open beaches and distance from major ports, appeared unlikely. Civilians living along the coast absorbed this logic indirectly. The defenses were there, yes, but the real threat, they believed, would come elsewhere. Behind the scenes, however, there were cracks. The Atlantic Wall was never complete. Resources were finite. Concrete and steel were prioritized unevenly. Some sectors were strong, others were symbolic. Many guns lacked sufficient ammunition. Communication lines were vulnerable. Mobile reserves were limited by fuel shortages and Allied air power. Yet these weaknesses were not visible from a farmhouse window or a village road. What civilians saw was mass, weight, permanence. And so, as 1944 approached, Fortress Europe became less a military system and more a shared assumption, a belief that the coast itself could not be undone. What German planners could not fully see, and what civilians could not imagine, was that the true battle would not be decided by concrete, but what arrived after the first wave. That realization would only come when the sea itself began delivering something unprecedented. Across the Channel, Allied planners were wrestling with a problem that no wall could solve. How do you supply an army without ports? The question dominated every discussion surrounding the invasion of Western Europe. Landing troops was only the first step. Keeping them alive, fed, fueled, armed, and reinforced would decide whether the operation succeeded or collapsed within days. Experience from earlier campaigns had been unforgiving. In North Africa and Italy, progress had slowed not from resistance alone, but from the inability to move supplies fast enough. Normandy posed an even greater challenge. The region lacked large, undamaged deep-water ports within immediate reach of the beaches. Cherbourg lay at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, heavily fortified and certain to be destroyed before capture. Smaller harbors were shallow, vulnerable, and easily interdicted. German planners believed this reality made Normandy a logistical dead end. Allied commanders understood the same geography and refused to accept its limitations. Planning for the invasion began years in advance. In Britain, warehouses filled with equipment whose purpose was not yet publicly known. Engineers sketched designs that looked less like military hardware and more like civil infrastructure. The solution they developed was radical. If Europe's ports could not be used, new ones would be built. Not on land, but at sea. The concept of artificial harbors had circulated quietly within British engineering circles since 1942. The idea was to assemble massive floating structures, breakwaters, piers, roadways, capable of being towed across the channel and assembled off an open beach. Once in place, they would transform raw coastline into functioning supply hubs. These harbors were named Mulberry. Each Mulberry was a system, not a single structure. Sunken block ships would form protective barriers against waves. Concrete caissons, some weighing thousands of tons, would be positioned to absorb the force of the sea. Floating roadways would rise and fall with the tide, allowing trucks to drive directly from ship to shore. It was industrial warfare at a scale few civilians had ever witnessed. Factories across Britain were tasked with producing components in secrecy. Civilian workers poured concrete into enormous forms, often without being told the final destination of their labor. Entire sections of coastline were closed off for testing. Tugs were modified. Engineers rehearsed assembly under simulated combat conditions. All of this unfolded beyond German observation. Air superiority played a crucial role.
Allied aircraft limited German reconnaissance flights, blinding defenders to the scale of preparations. Deception operations reinforced the illusion that the main invasion would strike elsewhere. Dummy units, false radio traffic, and misleading intelligence reports kept German attention fixed on the Pas de Calais. By the spring of 1944, the pieces were in place. What remained was execution. The success of the invasion would hinge not on the first hours, but on the days that followed. Every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every ration crate would determine whether Allied troops could expand beyond the beaches. The margin for error was narrow. A single major storm could destroy the entire effort. German planners believed the sea itself would enforce these limits. They did not know that the Allies had already planned for the sea's resistance. And when the invasion came, it would reveal a truth that Fortress Europe had never accounted for. Modern war could be built faster than it could be destroyed. That truth would soon be visible, not in battle reports, but in the endless movement of supplies across water and sand. Angle 1. Civilian psychology behind the wall. For German civilians living along the occupied coast, war had become a managed presence. Restrictions were routine, blackouts were observed. Soldiers passed through villages daily, yet daily life continued within clear boundaries. The wall provided a psychological buffer. It was visible reassurance, thick concrete that promised distance between civilians and the chaos consuming the Eastern Front. Reports from local administrators and security services reflected this mindset. Many civilians believed that even if an invasion occurred, it would be brief. The enemy might land, suffer catastrophic losses, and withdraw. The wall was expected to absorb the shock. This belief shaped behavior. Families stayed in place. Businesses continued operating near military zones. Some civilians watched the shoreline not with fear, but with curiosity. The defenses had become familiar landmarks, no longer symbols of danger. When the invasion began, this confidence did not collapse immediately. Artillery thundered, aircraft filled the sky, but the wall was still there. Guns were still firing. From inland villages, the sense was not of defeat, but of endurance. What unsettled civilians most was not the fighting, it was what followed it. By the second day, movement increased instead of slowing. Vehicles appeared in numbers that exceeded expectations. Supplies flowed inland without pause. The invasion was not stalling, it was organizing.
And that realization cut deeper than any bombardment. German defensive doctrine meets reality. German coastal defense doctrine rested on decisive assumptions. The invasion would be crushed at the waterline. Any forces that survived would be isolated. Without ports, the enemy would lack ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Time, it was believed, favored the defender. Field manuals emphasized static strength over mobility. Concrete was prioritized. Artillery positions were fixed. Reserve units were held back for counterattacks once the invader weakened. But the doctrine underestimated one critical factor: sustainment. As reports came in from Normandy, commanders noted a troubling pattern. Despite heavy losses on the beaches, Allied units were not slowing. Instead of shortages, there were signs of abundance. Infantry units advanced with consistent artillery support. Armored vehicles appeared sooner than anticipated. German intelligence struggled to explain how this was possible. The expected logistical bottleneck never materialized. Defensive planning had accounted for firepower, but not for an enemy capable of rebuilding infrastructure under fire. The wall had been designed to stop an army. It was never designed to stop an industrial system. And once that system reached the shore, doctrine began to fail in ways that no amount of concrete could fix.
The Allied logistics mindset. For Allied planners, logistics was not a supporting function, it was the main effort. American and British commanders understood that modern war was decided by movement and supply. Firepower meant little without fuel. Infantry stalled without food and ammunition. Speed depended on the ability to replace losses instantly. This mindset shaped every aspect of the invasion. While German doctrine emphasized denial, Allied doctrine emphasized continuity. The goal was not to avoid losses, it was to absorb them and continue advancing. Redundancy was built into every system. If one supply route failed, another would replace it. On the beaches of Normandy, this philosophy became visible. Engineers worked while fighting continued around them. Roadways were assembled under fire. Ships unloaded continuously, regardless of weather or enemy action. The priority was simple: keep material moving. From a distance, this activity looked chaotic, but to those who understood the plan, it was precision. Mulberry harbors, building permanence at sea. Within days of the landings, the most unexpected structures appeared off the Normandy coast. Massive concrete caissons, each taller than a house, were towed into position and sunk deliberately to form breakwaters. Old ships were scuttled in precise formations, creating calm water where open sea had dominated only days before. Floating roadways were anchored and connected, stretching from anchored ships to the beaches. These were the Mulberry harbors. To German observers, the sight was disorienting. The coastline seemed to be transforming. What had been exposed beachhead began to resemble an industrial port. Trucks rolled ashore in steady lines. Cranes operated continuously. The sea itself appeared organized. Mulberry B, constructed off the British-held sector near Aramash, became the most successful. Despite heavy seas and constant use, it handled thousands of tons of supplies daily. Fuel, ammunition, food, and vehicles arrived faster than German intelligence believed possible. The harbors did more than move material. They created psychological permanence. An invasion force that could build ports under fire was not temporary, it was staying. And every day the structures remained intact, the idea of Fortress Europe weakened. German intelligence confronts the numbers. German intelligence reports from mid-June 1944 began to reflect a troubling shift in tone. Initial assessments expected Allied supply difficulties within days. Instead, reports described increasing vehicle traffic, expanding depots, and sustained artillery fire. Aerial reconnaissance, when possible, confirmed the presence of large artificial harbor installations. Attempts to disrupt the supply flow met limited success. Air attacks were constrained by Allied air superiority. Naval interdiction was minimal. Long-range artillery lacked the accuracy and volume to significantly damage offshore structures. The most alarming detail was volume. Allied tonnage estimates exceeded pre-invasion projections. Ammunition expenditure did not decline. Fuel usage suggested preparations for deep inland movement. These were not signs of an army struggling to survive. They were signs of an army preparing to expand. German commanders faced a strategic dilemma. The invasion was no longer fragile, but it was not yet decisive. Delay favored the Allies. Action required resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantity. Behind the front, civilians noticed the same pattern without reading reports. The roads never emptied. Moral shock behind the lines. As supplies flowed ashore, the impact extended beyond the battlefield. Civilians observed convoys moving inland night and day. Trucks marked with unfamiliar symbols passed through villages at a steady pace. Temporary depots appeared in fields that had been emptied days earlier. The invasion was not just military, it was logistical. This constant movement created a sense of inevitability. Reports from local officials described growing unease. The expected pause never came. There was no lull, no sign that the enemy was weakening. Instead, the presence of Allied material increased with each passing day. The wall had failed to do what it promised. For civilians, the realization was quiet but profound. The defenses they trusted were being bypassed not just by brute force alone, but by organization and supply. The war, once distant, was now advancing inland with methodical certainty. And as Allied logistics tightened their grip on the region, the moment approached when defense would give way to collapse. That moment would arrive not in a single battle, but in a series of undeniable turning points that began at sea.
And as the supply flow stabilized, the true imbalance between attacker and defender began to emerge. That imbalance would soon become undeniable, not just to soldiers, but to civilians watching from behind the lines. By late June 1944, the invasion had moved beyond its initial shock. The beaches were no longer fragile footholds, they were arteries of supply. The Mulberry harbors, particularly Mulberry B off Arromanches, were operating at full capacity. Concrete caissons and sunken block ships protected calm water where open ocean had previously swept unimpeded. Trucks rolled continuously from ship to shore, each carrying tons of rations, fuel, and ammunition. Cranes unloaded tanks and artillery pieces faster than German observers had predicted possible. German commanders on the Cotentin Peninsula began reporting anomalies. Initial intelligence had expected the Allied advance to stall within days due to shortages. Instead, Allied forces moved with methodical precision. Infantry units pressed inland, supported by a continuous flow of artillery shells. Armored divisions appeared as if conjured from the shoreline, ready to exploit every weakness. The Germans attempted to respond. Luftwaffe sorties targeted convoys, but Allied air superiority limited impact. Coastal artillery shelled supply routes, yet many attacks missed their targets or inflicted only minor delays. Meanwhile, the Allies adapted quickly, rerouting trucks and replacing damaged equipment almost as fast as it was destroyed. On July 30th, 1944, reports from Cherbourg confirmed the looming problem. While the city remained under German control, the surrounding area was teeming with supplies. Every day, more fuel, ammunition, and provisions were stockpiled behind the front lines than the Germans had believed possible to deliver without a functioning deep-water port. Civilians began noticing the scale of the operation. Villages that had been empty now hosted temporary depots. Convoys, sometimes stretching for miles, passed through roads that seemed incapable of sustaining such weight. Children and farmers watched, sometimes in silence, as the Allied presence grew from a temporary incursion to a permanent, unstoppable force. For German defenders, the psychological impact was acute. Commanders had assumed that attrition and time favored them. That assumption evaporated as the first wave of material reinforcement reached inland objectives faster than anyone could have imagined. Even the heaviest resistance at coastal strongpoints could not halt this tide. Bunkers designed to dominate the beaches were bypassed by the continuous influx of supplies, and once the defenders realized that the enemy could replenish endlessly, the strategic balance began to shift irrevocably. The first phase of the logistical turning point had arrived. The beaches were no longer the bottleneck. The invasion had evolved into a self-sustaining campaign, and the Germans faced an uncomfortable reality. Fortress Europe had never accounted for this scale of industrial mobility.
Every concrete gun emplantment, every minefield, every coastal obstacle now confronted a relentless truth. The Allied supply chain was bigger, faster, and more resilient than anything the defenders had ever imagined. The tide, both literal and figurative, had turned. July 1944 brought a new stage in the unfolding crisis for German forces along the Normandy coast. Cherbourg, the deep-water port on the Cotentin Peninsula, remained under German control, but was isolated. The Allies recognized that capturing it intact would be ideal, yet even as engineers and assault units prepared, the Mulberry harbors continued to supply the advancing forces at a scale that defied expectation. The Red Ball Express was now operational. American planners had anticipated the need for relentless inland transportation. Thousands of trucks, drivers working in shifts around the clock, carried fuel, ammunition, and food from beachheads and artificial harbors to frontline units hundreds of miles inland. Each day, the tonnage delivered exceeded what German planners had predicted possible, even under ideal conditions. German communications reflected growing alarm. Reports noted entire divisions moving with unprecedented speed and coordination. Commanders expected bottlenecks, long delays that could be exploited to regroup and counterattack. Instead, the supply chain functioned seamlessly. Artillery units that should have run low on shells received replenishments without interruption. Tank crews that should have been immobilized by fuel shortages continued to push forward, threatening defensive lines before they could consolidate. Civilians observed this momentum with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Convoys stretched along rural roads, seeming endless, their drivers efficient and disciplined. Temporary depots sprang up overnight in fields, near farms, even along riverbanks. Villagers noted the uncanny regularity. Trucks arrived with no apparent pause, unloaded and departed only to be replaced by new arrivals the following hour. The psychological impact was profound. The once certain Atlantic Wall had not only failed to stop the invasion, but was now being circumvented by sheer organizational efficiency. German artillery and counterattacks attempted to slow the flow, yet Allied engineering and logistics adapted faster than they could react. Damaged Mulberry components were repaired and reinforced in hours. Detours around shelled roads were established almost immediately. The momentum of movement became unstoppable, transforming the invasion from a tentative beachhead into an operationally continuous advance.
By mid-July, the Allies had taken Cherbourg, completing the long-awaited capture of a functional deep-water port. The combination of artificial harbors, inland convoy networks, and operational discipline had rendered the German assumptions obsolete. Civilians and soldiers alike were witnessing the erosion of Fortress Europe in real time. What was once thought permanent, the coastal fortifications, the mines, the bunkers, was now being overrun, not by overwhelming numbers at a single point, but by relentless, sustained organization. The realization spread quietly but unmistakably among the German ranks. Time no longer favored the defender. Fortress Europe had been a myth maintained by propaganda, reinforced by concrete, and believed by civilians, but it could not withstand the logistical reality unfolding before their eyes. With supply lines running faster than destruction could keep up, and with Allied forces advancing continuously, the strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted. The Germans expected to hold, to force attrition, to slow the invasion.
Instead, they faced a relentless, methodical advance supported by the invisible power of industrial-scale logistics, a force that would determine the outcome of the campaign before a single large-scale battle inland could truly decide the front. The collapse of expectation was now complete. The stage was set for operational and moral defeat, both for the German defenders and for the civilians whose belief in the permanence of Fortress Europe had been shattered. The Allies had not only landed, they had arrived to stay. By August 1944, the consequences of the Normandy landings and the relentless Allied logistics were impossible to ignore. German defensive positions, once regarded as insurmountable, were being systematically bypassed or overwhelmed. The combination of Mulberry harbors, inland transport networks, and sustained air and artillery support had shifted the strategic balance irrevocably. Cherbourg, captured intact after intense fighting, provided a deep-water port that allowed even larger quantities of supplies to reach the front lines. The Red Ball Express continued to move thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and provisions every day. Infantry and armored units now advanced with unprecedented speed, forcing German units into continuous retreat along multiple axes. Roads that had been under observation for years now teemed with Allied movement. The beaches and hinterlands, once considered static, became arteries of a living, expanding operation. German commanders reported increasing civilian anxiety. Local officials noted empty warehouses replaced by Allied stockpiles. Towns that had been quiet were now bustling with continuous activity, and the sheer scale of American logistical power was causing widespread disbelief. Soldiers who had counted on time to reorganize found themselves under constant pressure. Every day, Allied units extended their reach farther inland. Operationally, the German army suffered compounding setbacks. The expected pause that would allow for counterattacks or reorganization never arrived. Communication lines broke down under the speed of the Allied advance. Fuel shortages became more acute as mobile reserves were consumed in retreating actions. Artillery positions, previously able to dominate the coast, were now exposed to flanking and encirclement. By late August, the Allies had liberated most of northern France, including key cities such as Caen and Avranches. The German defensive doctrine, once centered on static fortifications and delaying attrition, was rendered obsolete. Civilians, previously confident in the permanence of the Atlantic Wall, witnessed the systematic dismantling of their assumptions. Bunkers stood empty or abandoned, mines were cleared, and roads that were once blockaded became highways for Allied convoys. This collapse of operations marked not just a tactical defeat, but a psychological one. German soldiers and civilians alike were forced to confront the reality that Fortress Europe never existed in practical terms. The Atlantic Wall, despite its imposing concrete and steel, could not withstand the combination of planning, engineering, and sustained supply that the Allies had brought to Normandy. The impact of these developments would ripple across the Western Front, setting the stage for the liberation of Paris and the eventual push into Germany itself. The strategic initiative had passed permanently into Allied hands, and the myth of an impregnable European fortress was decisively shattered. As August 1944 turned into September, the consequences of the Allied logistical triumph became increasingly visible both on the battlefield and in civilian life. German units retreated towards the Seine and beyond, often in disarray. Reports from field commanders highlighted not just a shortage of supplies, but a collapse of morale. Soldiers who had relied on the Atlantic Wall to buy time now faced an enemy that could sustain itself faster than defenses could slow it. Civilians observed the transformation of their surroundings with a mixture of fear and resignation. Towns and villages previously quiet under German occupation now hosted a steady stream of Allied vehicles. Fields once empty of traffic became temporary storage sites. Depots sprang up in unexpected locations, barns, warehouses, even open farmland. The rhythm of life, previously dominated by scarcity and expectation of an attack, was replaced by the ceaseless pulse of supply and movement. Operationally, the Allies had redefined the concept of campaign mobility. The Red Ball Express alone delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies daily at its peak, keeping frontline forces fully operational while German units struggled to regroup. The combination of Mulberry harbors and inland transport networks allowed the Allies to extend their reach far beyond the immediate beaches, encircling German forces and cutting off lines of retreat.
Strategic documents from the German High Command show growing alarm. Plans that relied on delaying actions and attritional defense were rendered obsolete by the overwhelming flow of Allied materiel. Attempts to counterattack were undermined by fuel shortages, dispersed units, and the psychological impact of seeing enemy convoys appear faster than they could be destroyed. German soldiers began to report a sense of inevitability. No matter what positions they held, the enemy could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The impact of this logistical supremacy extended beyond immediate operations. It demonstrated a shift in modern warfare. Victory was no longer determined solely by battles won or ground taken, but the ability to sustain an army continuously in hostile territory. Civilian observers, often the first to notice the steady supply convoys, became unwitting witnesses to the changing nature of combat. Their trust in Fortress Europe, cemented over years of propaganda and reinforced by coastal defenses, was irrevocably broken. By early September, the Allies had liberated Paris. The flow of supplies that had begun at Normandy's beaches now fueled an advance across northern France. The Atlantic Wall, once thought indestructible, had become a symbol of miscalculated certainty. Civilians who had trusted its permanence now understood, in silent disbelief, that the true force behind the Allied success was not just firepower, but the invisible, relentless machinery of logistics. The collapse of Fortress Europe demonstrated that control of supply outmatched the might of concrete and steel. In this reality, perception gave way to fact, and the defenders' faith in immovable fortifications was replaced by the relentless evidence of material movement. The stage was set for the final phase of the campaign, the march into Germany itself, where the same principles, industrial capacity, continuous supply, and operational tempo would determine the fate of the Reich. The story of Fortress Europe is a story of perception colliding with reality. For years, German civilians and defenders alike had placed their trust in walls of concrete, in steel, in the myth of permanence. They believed that the coast itself could enforce limits, that time favored them, and that the Atlantic Wall was the final guarantor of security. Yet the Normandy campaign revealed a quiet but decisive truth. In modern war, logistics can outmatch fortifications. The Americans and their allies did not merely land on the beaches, they arrived with an unstoppable network of supply, a living system that turned temporary footholds into permanent pressure points. The sea, once thought a barrier, became a conveyor of reinforcements and materiel. Roads,
Trucks and floating harbors redefined the battlefield, making attrition and delay impotent against continuous movement. For civilians observing behind the lines, the realization was profound. The symbols they had trusted, the bunkers, the mines, the obstacles, were insufficient against organization and industrial capacity. Fear replaced confidence. The rhythm of daily life, once insulated by assumptions of safety, now reflected the unstoppable pace of an invading force that refused to pause. This campaign demonstrated a broader lesson about warfare. Victory is not won solely with firepower, bravery, or fortifications, but with the infrastructure that allows armies to endure, adapt, and persist. Logistics, often invisible, became the quiet weapon that shattered illusions, reshaped strategy, and redefined modern combat. As the Allies moved deeper into France and Germany, the image of Fortress Europe lingered only in memory. Civilians, soldiers, and historians would look back and understand that permanence is rarely what it seems. Concrete can crumble, steel can rust, but the capacity to supply, to organize, and to sustain, when executed with precision, is as formidable as any wall. In the end, Normandy was not just a landing, it was a revelation. And for those who had trusted in immovable defenses, it was a lesson in the unstoppable power of human ingenuity applied with relentless determination.